everyone. Welcome back to For the Girls. I'm Sarah.
I'm Chessa.
And I'm Tiggy.
Jumping into our special topic, driver rules. So, as we all know at this point, so much of being an F1 driver is not just about the car or getting in the car and finishing first. There's so much else to consider, like math, physics, tire and pit strategy. And on top of this, there's tons of rules and then also just kind of more best practices that drivers need to follow. And after all of the drama and controversy at the end of the 2021 season, the FIA actually published clarified driving standards. It's crazy to think that kind of for most of the sports history, a lot of these rules weren't clarified. And we'll get into this about how much written rules actually help when it still can be quite subjective. But these new guidelines generally explain what drivers can and can't do when wheel-to-wheel racing and helps drivers get a better sense of what the stewards are taking into account. This has been a much requested topic. Special shout out to Amanda Mellon in our Discord for the idea. So without further ado, let's jump right in.
Okay, so I think the biggest rule that we should start with, it's kind of like the most basic. It's that drivers can't impede, aka like they can't drive extra slow or erratically in a manner which would be deemed dangerous, of course, to other drivers and just like slow other drivers down and not allow them to drive their race. So that's kind of like the golden rule. And along the lines of basic proper conduct, drivers can't push each other off the track, of course. And also, if for whatever reason a driver themselves goes off the track, they can only rejoin, quote, when it is safe to do so and without gaining any lasting advantage. So we see this a lot when we're talking about lasting advantage. That would kind of entail slowing down to offset any time gained or giving back any positions or places that might have been gained from going off the track.
One thing too that's interesting about off track is we often think of someone kind of cutting a corner and passing someone and then needing to give that place back because that was an advantage gained off track. But this can also apply if you're the car in front and going off track somehow allows you to keep your lead when you would have been overtaken. So then you can also have to give the spot if someone would have had a valid overtake of you and you kind of dodged off track. So that's definitely a big one that I think is kind of one of the most common. And that's when you hear on the radio someone say swap places, give the place back, that sort of thing. It's because of this.
Yeah. So diving in relatedly to a driver when he is defending. So simply put, there is a, quote, one move defending rule. So verbatim from the FIA's International Sporting Code, it says, quote, more than one change of direction to defend a position is not permitted. So it's basically the no impeding rule. A driver can block on the inside once to stop a pass, but you can't weave back and forth to stop the overtake from happening again. So when we hear like, oh, he's weaving on the straight or something like that, that is not allowed. Things get a little bit more complicated when we're talking about attacking or overtaking because there are a lot of different scenarios. But let's start with the inside of a corner. So overtaking on the inside, which means passing, say you're going into a right-hand corner, you're passing on the right on the inside and vice versa if you're going left. The overtaking car needs to have a, quote, significant portion of their car alongside the overtakee. So that means that at the point that the car being overtaken is required to give, quote, sufficient room to the overtaking car. So it's a little confusing about what a significant portion means, but the guidelines generally say that it's when the overtaking car's front tires are alongside the other car by no later than the apex of the corner. So as you can see, there's like, yes, they're written down, but there's like a lot of wiggle room for kind of thinking about what a significant portion means and all that stuff.
And what's sufficient room? Yeah, it's so vague. It's like good that it is written, but obviously everyone's going to have a different idea of what leaving enough room is when someone's overtaking.
Like you're going 325 kilometers per hour. Like I don't think you were able to do like the whole physics equation of the apex of the corner, like all of that. So that's why a lot of it ends up going to the stewards. To finish on the kind of like attacking stuff, if you're going overtaking on the outside of a corner, so this is less common, but basically when the driver goes the long way round when overtaking the person in front of them, it's the similar rule. Like if the attacker has a significant portion of their car alongside, the overtakee needs to leave room. But in this case, significant portion here, the stewards consider that if the overtaking car is ahead of the other car from the apex of the corner. So when you hear drivers saying like he didn't leave enough room, things like that, they're usually referring to what we just talked about. So there is kind of like a sportsmanship thing that if you're getting overtaken, like you do have to give the other car somewhat of a chance.
Another big rule is not holding other people up, especially if you're a bit more of a back of the pack driver. So we see this with the blue flag, where a driver has 3 turns to get out of the way when the race leaders are coming up behind to lap the driver, and they just need to entirely get off the racing line and get out of the way. For quali, if a driver is on their out lap or their in lap and the driver behind them is on their flying lap, they also have to get out of the way or risk penalties. So you definitely see this as an issue in quali when people will get super upset if someone impedes their lap. Another flag we see occasionally, most specifically normally to K-Mag for whatever reason, we love to fact this, is the black and orange flag, which tells a driver they need to go back to the pit lane if they have unsafe damage to their car. Usually this is from something like front wing damage where they can keep going, but there's a chance like an end plate or something could fall off. And so there'll be a orange and black flag to make them pit to fix the problem.
If the driver is guilty of violating any of what we just talked about, they're reported to the race stewards, and then the race stewards will deem whatever penalties are necessary. And there's a big range of penalties here. So a common one is a driver just having to give a position back because they went off track and gained a lasting advantage. This can be because they cut a corner, passed someone off track, but it can also happen if they didn't pass someone, if they just managed to hang on to a lead by going off track, as we said. And then causing a collision by violating overtaking rules leads to penalties, those are often 5 or 10-second penalties that are served in pit stops, and work cannot be done on the car during that time, as we saw with the drama of the Aston Martin debacle and rear jack drama last race. But sometimes the time is just added at the end if they're not stopping. And then you can also, as we talked about, get penalty points on your license, and those accumulate over time, and those can eventually lead to a race ban. And the points can really add up even for more minor incidents like impeding in quali. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the track limits as well. But yeah.
And overall, this is when you hear people kind of mention a racing incident. So not every collision results in a penalty, because especially on the first couple laps or after a safety car restart, the stewards and the race directors are much more inclined to kind of let people race with the awareness that sometimes there can just be contact and be collisions and it's not necessarily anyone's fault. So sometimes there can be even a big crash when maybe someone had no way of avoiding the collision because there was an incident in front of them, or both people left enough room, but just something went slightly wrong. So sometimes that's also part of the drama. Something is deemed a quote unquote racing incident when people, AKA one of the people that was wronged, feels super strongly like there should have been a penalty.
Also somewhat relevant here are the track limits rules. We've seen a lot of drama around this, especially during quali. So good moment to give a little bit of a refresher. A track limit, that's the white line surrounding the outside of the track. That's there both to define the zone that's fair play and keep things safe for everyone. Track limits will vary from track to track. It's really hard to consistently police because of that. And the rules can even vary by corner and different corners at different circuits. So during practice and quali, any infringement of track limits results in the lap time being deleted. As we say, we saw that with Logan Sargent last race and with others many times before. And if the track limits are exceeded on the final corner, the next lap may also have to be deleted, which is at the mercy of the steward's judgment if a driver ended up gaining an advantage heading into that next lap. During the race, there's a little bit more leeway. Drivers receive 2 warnings on impeding track limits before they get the black and white flag, which warns drivers for unsportsmanlike conduct. If a driver ends up violating it, they get a 5-second penalty, and any more than that, they get 10 seconds. So this happened to Nico Hülkenberg at Bahrain last year. And typically once a driver violates the track limits 5 times or more during a race, they get a penalty point on their license. We saw this last year at the Austrian GP for Lando, Gasly, Vettel, and Zhou.
And this is an example of one of those things they're trying to change now, because it's kind of ridiculous that you can accumulate so many penalty points for things like track limits. So this won't be as much of an issue going forward, but that was crazy last year. And Max has commented in the past, he thinks there should be a bit more nuance around track limits penalties when a driver isn't obviously gaining an advantage. And he was saying kind of a lot of corners are blind and maybe all four wheels went over, but how much of an advantage is a driver actually gaining by doing that, by going like 6 inches wide? On some corners, they could actually be hurting themselves. So it's obviously really hard for them to see from the cockpits. They don't necessarily have perfect car placement all the time.
So hopefully with all of this explaining that we did, it'll be a little bit more interesting to watch races and overtaking once, you understand the rules more.